here. There we go. Back up and running. Hi, good morning. I just want to say I'm really excited to be here with you today, and that the Raptors are a really hard act to follow. So thank you so much, and many congratulations to the locals for an amazing championship. So over the past decade, I have worked at an art museum where I was one of two designers. And I worked at a really big tech company for quite a while where I was one of 2,000. And today, I currently work at a small hospitality startup where I'm one of a couple hundred. And it's through these experiences that I've learned that broadening the reach of design is more impactful than limiting it to a privileged few who have mastered a craft. So from designing exhibitions at the art museum to systems to organizational culture, I've also learned that it's more than product UI that needs our attention. So if you were to come visit me in San Francisco, where I'm based, by plane, you'd probably fly in and see the 30,000-foot view. And then as you're landing, you'd see the 15,000-foot view. And then obviously, as you're climbing the hill to your hotel, you might be 10 or 20 feet up. And then, coming back to Toronto, if someone were to ask you, how is SF? The image on the right is likely the one that you'd describe, because that's our human scale default experience. If we use these photos of a city as a metaphor for different representations of the same problem, systems thinking encourages us to embrace complexity and describe more than the street view, to seek patterns, map causes and effects, and to rationalize different kinds of relationships. So in the past year at Airbnb, I've been leading the design operations for our design language system. And when I started, the system already existed. It had been around for a couple of years. Its goal was to make it faster and easier for teams to make more consistent, efficient, and beautiful products. In 2016, a team was assembled to redesign the product. And out of that, they created the system. But trying to build both at the same time definitely came with some challenges. So the DLS right now is a design template, a code library, and some tools. And as a new hire, you get a 1-hour onboarding, and then you're sent on your way. If you get stuck, there's a weekly office hour, and you could come for Q&A, but that was kind of the extent of the design language at Airbnb for a couple of years. The core team who designed and built the system knew the guidelines like the back of their hand, but they never bothered to write them down. So as more teams started to use it, people had a lot of questions, like me. I asked, who or when should I use gradients? And someone would say, they're for special moments. But a special moment to whom? It was obvious that the system had a few loose screws that we could tighten. So out of my own struggle came a new mission, not focused on the product, but on people. How could we operate as system stewards who guide and take care of the community who's trying to use the system? My first instinct in this project was to visualize relationships. So I pulled apart a spreadsheet of the org chart and started talking to the people who tried to use our system. I spent 2 months doing nothing but listening to them. Then I asked people to write love letters and breakup letters to the design language. And I made a video to play for our design leadership to hear. It sounded something like this.
I love you because you make my life so easy. But sometimes adding new components or modifying an existing one is so hard.
DLS. It's complicated. I love you so. However, I need you to be more open. In the past, you communicated so well, but now I can never find your single source of truth.
Dear DLS, I do love you, but I need a break because there isn't a clear way to collaborate on changes or propose and then implement updates.
Hey DLS, I've had a great relationship with you so far. I love that you strive to create consistency and make me more productive. You provide templates and documentation and tools. You also have partners embedded across various teams. These are all great, but it is hard to use all of the offerings, and the process of contributing to DLS is still very opaque.
So after that screening, which is a little bit longer, our design director literally jumped out of his seat and up on the wall with a million ideas for how to improve the system and all the pain points he was hearing. Getting engagement really early aligned us around a common vision, and this was the first time everyone on the team started using design thinking to drive the next act of the system. So in Act 1, the system was just an offering. But in Act 2, my mandate was to put operations in place, which translated for me to mean putting a culture of care in place. The support of operations enables all teams to apply systems thinking, to use our offering, and really to contribute back to the community. So while researching, what came out of the research were 3 things that helped people understand their relationship to the design system. The first one was this cyclical behavior pattern of adoption. So, as you know, teams have a choice to use a system. You have to make it easier to use than not in order for them to accept. Going clockwise, the right side is all the things that teams do before they ever use your system. There's a decision-making process in place, and on the left side are the steps of integrating the system into their existing product workflows. It's important to know that if you make a team leave their workflow in order to use your system, you've likely lost some adopters. So once we had a way to think about adoption, we needed a way to understand the health of the system. If people decided to use it, what was their experience like today, and how should it be in the future? So what I started to build out was a maturity model to look at how design languages progress over time as they grow and evolve. And I assigned points to each category to develop an overall health score. On the left side, outdated areas of like people who maybe don't understand systems or they have a certain existing perception of them got 1 point. The progressive kind of people who are actually, making progress by using the system was 2, and those who really saw it as a bigger community and understood how to contribute back got 3 points. So, for example, if a team had told us that they would get around to using the system when they had time, but they were busy with a big launch deadline, that commitment was kind of seen as low, and it showed how the team thought of their work as new and the system as outdated. If a team had filed tickets for accessibility bugs or styling enhancements in their product sprints or on their roadmaps, they had made some kind of progressive commitment to using the design system. And, for example, if they might actively write documentation or actually contribute components or feedback to the team, we saw that as a pretty high commitment of time and resources to making the system more modern. And lastly, we started diagramming a kind of architecture to help people understand what the system was made of and how the DLS spanned across a lot of different offerings and platforms. So once we had these mental models for understanding and measuring the system, it was time to start piloting different forms of stewardship. The first thing that we designed was a program to hack the system. In the 2 years prior, designers didn't really have a feedback loop to share local systems knowledge. Nominated by their managers, these designers raised their hand to work on improving the system, and they were given time to co-design new patterns and theming, and honestly anything else that they could dream up. It was not about constraints, but innovation. So now we have about 25 designers attending in 4 different offices from all parts of the business on a bi-weekly basis. A year later, I can safely say that your system is only as strong as the relationships that you have with the teams who use it. Our designer in our UXP program that we surveyed said that showing up to UXP partners has been the best thing about the design system since it was created. Lastly, we built a contribution model. Historically, product team work was impossible to find and reuse, and therefore teams wasted time redesigning and coding already solved problems from scratch. What was more important to me is that it also meant that teams never saw their product work reflected in the system. They were being asked to use something that they weren't a part of and didn't belong to. So we created a contribution model with them that all teams could give back with a simple goal of just making their work visible. At this point, it actually doesn't matter so much for us whether or not the component is of a certain level of quality. What we're caring about right now is that you can find it and that you can reuse it. And this way, the more teams that use other teams' components, the more that they're incentivized to up-level the quality organically through just making updates to the product. As part of this process, designers volunteer an hour a week to review components for other designers. So it isn't just the design system team looking at the components. And it's not to make a decision about whether or not a component is good enough to go into the templates, but just to mark what is baked into the component for free if you reuse it. On the engineering side, the team built a tool that makes all the components easy to search and reference with standard naming and screenshots from the product with supporting documentation all in one place. So far, in 2 months, we have had over a dozen contributions in our pilot from across the business, and we just sent out a newsletter monthly to celebrate those teams. But our vision eventually is that this new behavior just becomes business as usual. So now that I've had a chance to dive deep on what I've been doing with system operations, I'm going to zoom all the way out to the 30,000-foot view and talk about why the current way that we're defining design systems in the industry is limiting their potential. Defining design today is really messy business. Design is so many things. It's a discipline, it's a proposal, it's a process, it's an outcome, and somehow designers are supposed to be good at all of it. But at the intersection of all of these different types of design is different types of relationships. Relationships between what we make and what we think, relationships between the people that we work with who may have very different definitions of design than us, and relationships between products and users, all driven by very small decisions that we make over time. And with so many decisions to make, systems are put in place to govern the smaller decisions that organizations have already aligned around, and to automate rote tasks that designers used to do, like drawing certain kinds of rectangles. If you ask a designer today, any of them will tell you that they would love to make the world a better place. Design isn't about designers, it's about solving a problem for people and their environment. And often, design system talks tend to focus on the technical achievements of systems. But today I'd like to talk about how instead they help designers make a human impact. So today, most designers are in some kind of relationship with design systems. They either make one, or they use one, or ideally a little bit of both. And this is because companies are increasingly asking designers to facilitate more complex decision-making. No longer just designing screens and flows, but also data models, machine learning models, and business models that, while hidden under the surface, all have an effect on people. So here's a framework for how I'm thinking about the evolution of design systems. It's scaffolded from Indy's ethics framework, which I highly recommend checking out online. I call it the design system hierarchy of human needs. So it's pretty simple. At the bottom of the pyramid, designers are making decisions about things like product UI. And as we know, product UI tends to manifest as components and impact humans by way of reducing the amount of effort that they have to put in order to use your product. Then we start making decisions about services, and we tend to map those, and they manifest through journey systems and impact higher level needs for soulful human experiences. And then at the very top sits the most high-level decisions about what people value, which manifests usually as some kind of model or principle or process, which directly impacts human rights. An example of where value systems might come into play might be when a startup is trying to figure out its business model. So on the left, if a company decides that they want to share their knowledge or data, they could manifest their business through an open source model, which promotes human rights and accessible information to education. On the other side, if a company decides that they value their intellectual capital in a proprietary way, their privatized business will likely manifest and promote the human right to compete in the market or gain a profit. Think about the difference between maybe like a Khan Academy or a charter school. These are two of many different directions that a company could take, but in each one, there's a system being governed by a few key decisions that are already being put in place that directly affect people's rights. So now that you're somewhat familiar with the framework, I want to talk about the first order of design systems, and that's the systems of components. If you do a Google search today on design systems, you'll find so many pieces and parts that if we curated them all into a big bucket of Legos, we may never have to design another button or menu in our lifetime. Right now, the problem is that design systems are defined mainly by what we can see. Many companies reference components right in the definition of design systems, but the blocks add up to something more. For example, at Airbnb, we use a pattern that suggests a price for hosts to charge based on information about their home and about trends in the local rental market. This reduces a ton of time that hosts would usually put into researching the right price point for their listing. So instead of measuring components by well-written code and clean UI, measure a successful component by the return that you bring to users on their investment of time, emotional energy, and the mental and physical effort that it takes to use your product. This is Airbnb's product after the redesign that yielded their design system. And once the direction was set, the team started to look at individual screens. And they broke out common solutions to general user problems by their components. Components were very simply named, and they were set up to be very modular. They work on their own so that when you need a specific piece of functionality, it's there, and you can use it across different platforms and contexts. You can also make your own component using the primitives when necessary. How it works and how it looks is very specifically defined because at the time, Airbnb had used their system to solve the consistency problem, so that the entire experience of using their app felt very cohesive. Part of the solution was also making sure that the components were abstracted enough so that they could be mirrored in code. The engineer has the same naming as the design file specs, no matter the platform. And it's very device agnostic. You define it once, and it's built in many different form factors. When the language is the same, an engineer could actually code this design without potentially even seeing it. In part, this is the power of the system, the relationship that it bridges between the designer and the engineer. So in the first order of systems, designers are no longer just making one-off components. Their energy is actually dedicated to defining new parameters and new arguments for why a system functions the way it does in order to help reduce the amount of effort that a user has to put in. The second order of design systems that I'm going to be talking to you today about is journey systems. So we know that users don't fall in love with our products because of component libraries. We design for love and belonging by mapping the user's experience through journeys. And at Airbnb, the central story that drives our products is the Snow White journey. Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs began actually in the mid-1930s, and it started with a storyboard that helped all of the film's collaborators understand the vision. Airbnb's CEO was really inspired by Disney, and he hired animators from Pixar and brought everyone together to design the end-to-end journey for hosts and guests and guide a deep understanding of the Airbnb community. Storyboards inspire a feeling that words alone can't express. Each storyboard represents the steps that hosts take along their journey, and this includes things like considering hosting, preparing a place for guests, and building a lasting reputation as a good host. And in a tech world full of situations that are constantly grasping for our attention and never really finish, creating narratives that start and end satisfies that craving that we have as humans to complete a journey and feel that sense of accomplishment. How you choose to make a journey really depends on your goals. If you want to understand how much surface area a journey covers that's in the actual product and whether or not steps are missing or whether there are actual physical steps, attaching UI screens to journey boards might help. You can also track teams who are working on each part of a journey to your company and see if maybe there are areas where you're not investing. At Airbnb, teams actually create scorecards for things like growth or task completion. And sometimes we find that in one phase, there are many different paths a user could take. So it's not necessarily a linear process. Journey columns represent these larger phases, and there's always these small steps and represented as cards underneath them with key moments of the journey highlighted. Underneath each column, it's data and metrics from your research teams, and then they usually add user goals, pain points, or different opportunities. It's important for journeys to express first what a host or guest is actually doing, second, what they're unable to do, and most importantly, what it is that they need. Journeys can include other interesting topics too, like financial models and pricing structures, and some even have rows for unintended consequences and the risk, for example, of potential bias or discrimination. So sometimes it's the invisible things that you want to actually make visible in the journey in order to make sure that your teams really think deeply about it. So each journey gives your business a really high level and granular representation of the user experience. They can zoom in and zoom out to make decisions with all the data and insights at any given moment. So the power of the journey system is that it transforms businesses to invest in human needs instead of product features. It turns data into stories. It promotes collaboration across teams, across your product teams, your finance teams, your legal teams, your policy writing teams, and it helps provide an honest picture to where to guide investments and strategy. The third and final order of design systems I'd like to talk to you about today is value systems. Values are shaped by our lived experiences. Some are conscious and others are not. We tend to think that we can think through all perspectives, but when we're working really fast, we tend to make snap judgments. When we realize that maybe we've made a mistake, it's not common that a company incentivizes us to go back and fix it. But we should be. Recently, creative director Jennifer Hom found a problem with our illustration styles at Airbnb. As she was gathering different opinions from coworkers, one key insight that struck her was when she showed them illustrations like this and they said, "It doesn't represent me." And that did not align with Airbnb's core mission to help people belong anywhere. So she partnered with Airbnb's employee resource group for people living with disabilities, and the design team directly engaged with people about their lived experiences and started to redesign the illustrations to reflect them. These kinds of illustrations show that design systems have the potential to help designers make the world a better place. When we focus on human rights, like the rights to be seen and heard and depicted in authentic ways. We also design systems with Airbnb's end users who all have very diverse backgrounds and ability levels. Recently, one of my colleagues said that in his research, he found a technologist with blindness who said something that I will never forget. They said, "I don't want to browse the internet and have a separate experience in accessibility mode. I want to use the same thing as what everyone else uses. The internet is one of the safest places for me because it disguises my disability. I don't want to be relegated to a digital ghetto." And when we design systems, we have to actively choose not to perpetuate the the segregation, discrimination, and exclusion that happens to people in the physical world. At Airbnb, what we're aspiring towards is one universal experience, which includes the widest diversity possible for our community. And this goes for employees, too. So for the past 8 months, I've been working with a team on reducing bias and discrimination from Airbnb's career framework. Through research, we learned that experienced designers were doing different types of product strategy and management work that was unconsciously being excluded from the framework. Words like sees and listens were ableist language, which means that this language was not inclusive of people with low vision or hearing. Often people would also ask questions about the language. What is the meaningful difference between inspires and leads and directs? Words were pretty fuzzy. In our feedback sessions, teams would ask, how many times do I need to prove something in order to be considered for a promotion? And there were a lot of questions about how to better distinguish individual contributors from managers. So I believe that the career framework is one piece in a larger design system for people. They are as essential as design systems for products. Every dimension of this system directly impacts people's performance, their salary, their career development, and their sense of accomplishment. To remain relevant in the future, designers really need to start holding themselves accountable and others for their unconscious values. That sounds like a really difficult task. It might be the most challenging one to date. So in the 1960s, Charles Eames described designing a lamp. And what he said was that the first step in designing anything was not to ask how it looks, but whether it should even be. And it's a timeless and essential question that too often goes overlooked in favor of shipping and outcomes. Yet designers are just as valuable for influencing what a company doesn't make as for what it does. I'm often asked if I think that design systems will replace designers. If you think about design systems through the lens of human needs, I don't think we can delegate that understanding to machines just yet. Systems won't replace designers, but designers do need to replace our myopic focus on design systems as visual component libraries and start to ask ourselves, what other systems can we influence to drive towards even higher human impact? Things like financial systems, healthcare systems, management systems, justice systems, and political systems. And just as important, what systems have we made already that are currently in place where we negatively impact user needs, and how do we fix those? Maybe the hierarchy is upside down. Now that components have gotten us so far in reducing human effort, what if we made values the foundation for our systems and we started building human rights into our business models, our data models, our machine learning models, and then documenting the why behind those decisions in a systematic way? Human rights like access, safety, sustainability, tolerance, respect, dignity, inclusion, and providing closure to an experience. Consider which human rights you would frame your system around. Would this way of thinking potentially change the experiences that you design for? If good design is good business, then to me, the common denominator there is doing good. So when designers are freed up to think bigger, let's reach for the highest form of human impact and create systems that produce a better world for everyone. Thank you.